time now for The World This Week, where 4 journalists sit down with me to talk about the stories that have been making the headlines in the last 7 days. Now, joining me tonight is Greg Vicuzzi, a journalist from Bloomberg News Bureau here in Paris. Greg. Marcus Maybury from the International Herald Tribune, apparently normally based in London, but fortunately for us, spending a few weeks here in Paris. Alberto Romagnoli, the Paris correspondent for Italy's Rai TV, and John Keating, the Paris bureau chief for the Kuwait news agency. Thanks to all of you for being with us. First to Syria. And the bitter and bloody struggle continues for Aleppo, the country's largest city. Rebels fighting President Assad's forces are promising a counterattack after losing ground earlier this week. They've already been pushed back from the Saladin district by government troops seeking to re-establish control over the country's economic hub. And this is all happening as the West is increasingly focusing its efforts on assisting the opposition, with Britain announcing this Friday that it's going to be handing over an extra £5 million worth of aid to the rebels. That apparently is going to include the likes of medical supplies, water purification systems and communications equipment. Let's take a listen to what the British Foreign Secretary had to say.
We're not giving military advice. I think it's very important for us to help prepare for the day after Assad. This is, in our view, a doomed regime, albeit a regime that is still ruthless, still immensely dangerous, still has a strong military capability. It is doomed ultimately, and so part of our job, again, as members of the UN Security Council, is to work with people who might be in a position of authority in Syria in the future.
British Foreign Secretary William Hague there. First of all, to Marcus, not giving military advice, as he just says. I'm just wondering, how does that work when you're handing over communications equipment to rebels who are operating in an arena of war?
It's a bit of a fig leaf. It allows Britain diplomatically to say that we're not offering lethal aid, that we're not actually involved in the military fight here, but this is support that is crucial to the rebels. This is support they're going to need to hold and retake parts of Aleppo and other cities where the civil war has now spread. But it is a kind of half measure, and the question is, how long will the West actually increasingly see pressure both from politicians and from ordinary citizens saying they want the massacre in Syria to end, they want the West, they want their leaders to do more to get on the side of the rebels. The West, every government, whether in Paris or in London or in Washington, it doesn't want to do that because they don't want to get more involved in it than they already are. But the question is, how long can they resist that kind of push to get more
Do you
involved?
think they're going to supply those communications equipment about the appropriate language that should be used when radioing between?
They probably do have a little thing they read and say, this is what we have to tell you, and then it's used elsewise.
Greg, as Marcus just pointed out, it seems clear that the West is seeing that, there's no possible diplomatic solution. If anything, the peace plan is in tatters. Kofi Annan has resigned. Why bother keep up such a pretense anyway about a diplomatic
I'm not sure they are keeping a pretense anymore. I think they've all given up on any chance of having any negotiated solution. I think for two reasons. One is the Chinese and the Russians have made it clear they're not going to budge, and two, even if they did, it's probably too late at this point to have a solution. There has to be a military, to have a political solution. It's too late. There really probably has to be a military solution at this point, and I think that probably the French, the British, and the Americans do want to provide more aid. They can't do it for international law reasons. They can't do it because it's an election year in the U.S. They don't really need another war in the Middle East. But I think we're going to see a ticking up of the sort of support the French and the British and the Americans and the Turks could give the rebels. I mean, now it's communication equipment. It's not going to be an intervention like in Libya. I think that's out of the question. But I think the sort of things that are going to be given to the rebels is you're going to see a notching up of the sort of aid they give.
Do you think, John, we're ever going to see a situation of actual international intervention?
No, definitely not. Not in Syria, not armed intervention anyway. And I think that the United States, Britain and France don't really need to give weapons at this stage to the FSA and the rebels because they're getting plenty from Saudi Arabia and from Qatar. I think
Turkey is giving them a lot of
through
help.
Turkey, yes, in particular. But I think, and also there are freelancers bringing them in through Lebanon. So they're getting the weapons that they need to hold off, but they won't be able to resist the onslaught from the Syrian forces who are far superior. They're going to lose Aleppo. They're going to get pushed out, and then it will be a guerrilla warfare, I think, in the background. But I think it was very curious to see Haig today saying that they would give them body armor, as if that was some sort of little gesture on top of what they were giving in medical supplies. And the French have been giving communications equipment for some time now to the rebel forces. So I don't see any major intervention of any sort military. And there are two camps basically established now. I mean, Iran arranging its own little conference to counter the Paris conference and to counter the efforts from the opposition. They had Russia and China. So it's very clear the divisions in the Security Council are being reflected on the ground.
Alberto, I mean, the Italians at the moment have an enormous financial crisis to deal with. Have they also been offering any help as such, or are they, consumed by other worries?
Something from the humanitarian point of view as other countries. I think that if the refugees will become tens of thousands, probably the attitude even of the Europeans will tend to change. Because I think that we are going to be near to have a humanitarian crisis. We see pictures of people bombed. I think that if I had the family, I would run away of the country. If the refugees will be an enormous quantity, probably the attitude would be different.
Marcus, as John just said, and others have been saying, we're in the middle of an election year, and the likelihood of this happening or upping the assistance as far as the US is concerned is extremely unlikely. But if indeed Obama did win a second term, do you think the landscape could then change?
I don't think so. Not in this case. I mean, certainly the events of the world can direct U.S. politics, and U.S. politics can have an overwhelming effect on U.S. foreign policy far too often. But I think in this case, the situation in Syria is so complicated, and what happens post-Assad is so dangerous, given the sectarian divisions in the country, given its incredibly important part in the middle of a very volatile neighborhood, that no one actually knows, how do you have a secure and stable transition after Assad. And so I think that's a real problem. And I think the American election, frankly, won't change that, whether Obama is reelected or Romney wins. I don't know if this is actually a conflict that anyone can win. I don't think diplomacy has a chance, but I'm not sure military fight actually brings you to a solution. So it may be a question of kind of the high-power defections we've seen this week and more defections. Maybe it has to be an internal falling away of the allies of the regime to actually bring a change. I don't know.
Well, people have been talking about just how much each side has, and at this point I just want to take a look at who has got what, because we understand on the government side that the SUD has somewhere around 325,000 troops with the help of an additional 100,000 militia troops, whereas on the rebels they've only got 70,000 people on the ground. And then you've got, in terms of tanks, for instance, Assad's forces have it close to 5,000, while the rebels have only got 14, and a number of which we assume they commandeered from the army as such. Certainly, Greg, this is not a conventional war by any stretch of the imagination, is it?
No, it's not. But of those 300 and some thousand Syrian army troops, I'm not sure how many of them the regime can totally trust. I mean, there have most of the rebel forces are defectors from the army, so I'm not sure if all of those are usable forces. And guerrilla wars. Okay, 70,000 regular fighting members of the rebels, but then that doesn't count how much sort of civilian support that they can count on. I mean, when you're talking an asymmetrical, as they put it, guerrilla war like this, those sort of numbers just don't matter in the same way they do in a conventional war. So a bit more complicated.
Okay, well, time now to change tune. And the three members of Pussy Riot, the Russian punk band accused of hooliganism for an unauthorised performance in a Moscow cathedral, made their last court appearance this Wednesday after a week-long trial. Now, the verdict is set to be announced on August 17, but for many, both inside and outside of Russia, this whole affair has been a litmus test for the country's democracy. I want to start off with you, Alberto. Why do you think the women did this?
But since they are artists, so they wanted to attract the attention. But I think that what they did touch two very sensible problems: Putin, and the role of the church in Russia. So I think that they are developing a debate all over the world from artists and so on. So there is a role of public opinion that I think that I don't know how much the Russians know that artists are giving their solidarity to the three girls. So it's interesting to see if the West can do something for a problem like this.
Marcus, do you think this is a sort of a calculated risk, a calculated gimmick, if anything, to make the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, look bad in the eyes of the West?
That's a great question. I don't know because I haven't talked to the Pussy Riot members.
I've been waiting to say that on air, I have to say.
Well, I must say, I don't know how many times I've actually said that word on television.
But we had a lot of fun upstairs in the newsroom, as you can imagine, when it came to writing the headline. But
and
please
of course,
go on.
that's why they have that name, right? This is what they want to do. This is, as Alberto said, they want to attract attention. This is what you do. But I'm not quite sure they knew, and I'm not sure even anyone knows. I'm not sure most Russians know. I'm not sure the regime itself knows how far you can push this regime. And actually, in a kind of, again, in the West, this would be an innocuous, actually not an innocuous vignette, even in the West. If they had done the same thing, you can imagine in Italy, in a house of worship, there would have been serious repercussions. Yeah. People would have been upset. And that's part of what artists seek. But I'm not sure anyone knows how far this regime will punish them. And that's the kind of thing that becomes kind of scary. And it's not a Western regime. It's not one that it has... some people, some opponents have suffered the greatest possible penalty for going up against this regime. And you don't know where they're going to go in this score.
John, do you think it's misfired? I mean, do you think they've certainly they've alienated the establishment of the Russian Orthodox Church, but what about its followers?
Well, I think Russia is a very conservative country, and I think a lot of people want to see them punished. And I think a majority of people in Russia would probably think that Putin is justified in taking some sort of action. He himself has asked for some form of leniency. I'm not sure he means it. He doesn't like to be criticized. He doesn't like personal criticism, and he's very sensitive.
Like punk music either.
No, but he would consider that a matter of taste. But to attack him personally and invoke a religious figure to help kick him out of power, he doesn't have any idea of leaving power anyway. And to bring religion into it, I think he used that as probably his whipping boy, to be able to attack these people. But it's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. I mean, in the 80s, we had the Sex Pistols and Johnny Rotten, who insulted the Queen, insulted the Parliament, insulted everyone in England, and people just ignored them. And I think that was probably would have been a smart thing for Putin to do.
Greg, there's been some criticism that the women, when they've appeared in court, have been very laid back. They've been very cool in their demeanour, and that sort of hasn't gone down well with the Russian public.
They certainly have not shown contrition, that's for sure.
There's no weeping or wailing.
No. And I'm not sure whether that would win their cases. But I think we were talking earlier about support from artists around the world. I think that's probably not working in their favor. I'm not really sure that most Russians want to be criticized by Madonna or Lady Gaga, and I'm not really sure that does help the case of these young women. I think Alberto really put it on that they hit two targets simultaneously. One which was to go up against Putin's dislike of being criticized, and two, to insult a Russian Orthodox establishment that already feels under fire on all sorts of fronts, and really wants to hold the line on this one. So we'll see what sort of a sentence they get.
Alberto, I mean, what it has done is shone a sort of a rather unwanted light on Russia's judiciary. Does it show that, it operates independently of the Kremlin?
We have a problem of justice in that country. That's one of the reasons why they have to find a quick solution and to take away the light from this case. I think that this is, from this point of view, is dangerous. Even I agree that probably they will. The public opinion is asking for a punishment. It's not considered a freedom of expression act.
Marcus, in terms of what will come out of this, I mean, obviously we're still waiting for the verdict, but do you think that this has helped the opposition movement as such, all this controversy?
I think in the long term it has to. I think in the long term, especially generationally, is I think where it makes a difference. It plants a seed of revolt or of independence or freedom of expression or freedom of thinking, of mind, in a young generation. I think that young generation, because right now, what we saw in the protest movement back in December in Russia, it was largely kind of middle class, kind of privileged. It really wasn't a popular kind of widespread mass movement. But I think these seeds of rebellion, plant it in a young generation who will remember having watched this as they were young people, I think then you can see a decade from now where maybe it will really come to fruition and make a difference. I don't think in the short term it will, but I think in long term it may. I think it's hard it won't. It's hard to imagine this big, massive, rich country that is Russia does not change in the next decade or so.
And John, as Mark's just pointed out, I mean, part of the problem with the opposition has been that it's sort of been associated with these sort of wealthy yuppies who, have iPhones, iPads and live the good life in Moscow. I mean, do you think that's still the case at this stage?
No, I think that, people like Pussy Riot will get the support of intellectuals who feel that any crimping of their freedom to develop, their freedom to think, etc., as Mark said, they will definitely get the support of the intellectuals. But the majority of Russian people will not support this kind of thing. They will look at them as hooligans, as which is being charged with hooliganism. And I think they will want them to be punished. I think Putin would be smart here if he managed to get it across that he had asked for them to be pardoned or, some sort of get rid of this because it's causing a lot of bad press for him.
Well, this is what I wanted to just quickly pick up on because, Greg, I was reading on the web earlier today that he is indeed very worried about the international image of Russia as a result of this, and has told his diplomats to get out there and do what they can. Do you think they'll be able to do something?
I'm not really sure that Putin is that worried by what the view is of the West. I mean, there have been plenty of other trials that the West has criticized quite strongly.
Investors is what he's particularly worried about as such.
Not really sure that someone's going to make I think what worries foreign investors is just the general sense of the rule of law in Russia and how difficult it is to get contracts enforced and things like that. I'm not sure that what happens to three punk rockers is really top concern of some oil businessmen in Russia. If Putin was that worried about his image in the Western world, there's plenty of other trials and cases where he could have acted before and he didn't. So I'm not sure he's that concerned.
Okay, well, we have to wrap now for a quick break. Do stay with us. We'll be back in a few minutes' time for the second part of The World This Week.